So stay with me, Jeanette, and we'll go to the panel and I'll ask Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, who's going to join us as well. She's the Ambassador at Large for Cybersecurity at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we're going to ask Caitriona Heinl to moderate this panel for us. And Caitriona is Executive Director at the Azure Forum for Contemporary Security Strategy and an Adjunct Research Fellow at the University College Dublin. So Caitriona, good afternoon to you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. Please shout if you can't. I'm conscious of the connection. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be moderating this session today. I see familiar faces on our panel. And I would also like to thank the US Embassy, Dublin BIC and Boston College for organising this for all of us. In our session today, the particular focus that we have is to delve a little bit more deeply on the global public-private sector cooperation question. Jeanette has already alluded to some of the EU issues with respect to digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy. So again, we might get into that more deeply as the conversation goes on. But it's safe to say we have two of the best placed experts to speak to these questions today. Jeanette can speak to the specific focus of the panel with her high-level experience as Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity at DHS previously, but also now working in a global tech firm like Google. And then we have Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, who is the Estonian Ambassador for Cyber Diplomacy. And Heli is without doubt one of the most expert cyber diplomats in Europe, if not globally, given her experience at national level in Estonia, but also with the European External Action Service. So Heli, I hope you don't mind me saying that you are in the Premier League when it comes to cyber diplomacy. And it's lovely to see you again today. So to begin, Jeanette, we spoke very briefly about the kind of the direction we wanted to go on the panel. And firstly, I think it would be good to hear from you about how businesses and governments can work together a bit more closely and effectively when it comes to cybersecurity questions like incident response or cyber preparedness. In particular, if you have examples of national good practices, I know you're based in the United States, but there might be other national good practices that you feel we can draw upon. I think that would also be good to hear. So thank you, Jeanette. I'll pass the floor to you.
Great. Absolutely. I think the U.S. definitely doesn't have a monopoly on best practices for public-private partnership. And in fact, when I was in the government, spent a lot of time learning from other governments and how they were approaching. So I think, the U.S. has been working on this public-private partnership model for cybersecurity for going on 20 years now, if my math is right. And we've learned a lot over the process. The importance of having open multi-stakeholder dialogues, ensuring that all voices are represented in, if you're looking at that kind of the broader ecosystem of the internet, where are those voices if we want to continue to maintain the global open internet that we've all tremendously benefited from. The need to have those transparent, open conversations with multiple stakeholders, very important. And I think Europe has done an especially good job, both as the Union, but also individual countries. And I will not steal anything from our Estonian ambassador, because I think Estonia is just really such a model in how to do this, leading across Europe, but also within Estonia. So I will let the ambassador speak to the specifics there. I would also say there's very interesting examples in Asia, in looking at Japan and South Korea and the work that they're doing to define critical infrastructure in the Middle East and Israel. And everybody has different, as a country, slightly different approaches. We all have the same overall goal objectives. Generally those countries that are seeking to maintain that open interoperable internet, but individually, I think my experience is what works best is, in addition to these multi-stakeholder dialogues, is having clear goals that you are trying to achieve. Oftentimes people lump all public-private partnerships for cybersecurity as one kind of grand thing. And the most important thing I think I learned is there are certain things sort of subordinate to that, right, that we want to achieve, whether that's a better, more scalable incident response to be able to respond to, you know, heaven forbid, a very large disaster for our country. That is one set of conversations that requires specific organizations, and we want to have specific outcomes. There's another set of conversations when you talk about increasing better global norms for cyber behavior by governments. That is obviously another conversation with a different set of organizations that continues to be had. So really defining what you want out of your public-private partnership is important, and being clear, and all parties are clear, whether I'm on the government side or whether I'm on the private sector side, of what the outcomes you're seeking to achieve. It's also important to recognize the marketplace and how the marketplace is evolving, and in making sure that government is clear about both the economic and the security goals that they're trying to achieve, and how to achieve both of those, and recognizing that sometimes, frankly, they're in tension. So I will say the last piece is important, I think, is relying on as much as possible global international standards. And if they don't exist, working to develop those, and really having, if we continue to maintain that goal of having that global open internet, then we want to ensure that we have things like open source, that is, you know, robust, vibrant open source ecosystem, international standards, things that can be applied as much as possible globally where it makes sense. I'll pause there. Back to you, Caitriona.
Great, thank you very much, Jeanette. I think two key messages I'm hearing here. You know, thinking beyond the US and EU in terms of some of the good practices we're seeing in other regions like Asia when it comes to Japan and South Korea, and their work on defining critical infrastructure, but also, and Heli might come to this, but how to strengthen multi-stakeholder dialogues by having clear goals and defining the outcomes, the optimal outcomes that we are seeking. So with that, Heli, I think with your experience at the national, regional, and also UN level, from a government perspective, are there effective ways in your mind that we can work to increase this type of cooperation globally? Thank you, Heli.
Thank you, Caitriona. And I'm always very glad to speak at the Irish event. I think it's already the second of this series when I'm speaking. And as a small country in Europe, similar to Ireland, Estonia actually has built its own national public-private partnership on cybersecurity already more than 10 years ago. The major elements for our public-private partnership include very clear objectives, as our previous speaker was telling them. The objectives and goals are important in public-private partnership, and I absolutely subscribe to this notion, because when Estonia started to develop its national cyber strategy in 2007, after the serious test we had towards our digital society here in 2007, we actually set a very clear goals with the first national cyber strategy, which was the first full of government cyber strategy in the world at that time. And this strategy has been the model for our national cyber resilience systems ever since. And of course, now we have like the fourth iteration of the strategy already happening, but it's the same logic that applies. So secondly, we also set a very clear governance structure already very early, how the different players and different stakeholders are functioning in this broader framework. And this governance structure is not just a formal governance structure. There is also the element of informal cooperation and informal information exchange there. But there is also the element of formality that has helped to put national resources into the cyber project. And of course, very importantly, there is also a very important element of coordination between different stakeholders. And this coordination requires also the clear set of functions and division of labor between the national players. So, and in Estonian case, we set up the National Cyber Agency that is also in charge of the e-governance. So because Estonia is a small country, we do not have thousands of agencies with overlapping tasks. So we are trying to make sure that rather we coordinate between different agencies and make sure that both the public sector and the private sector would talk to each other. And I think our resilience system actually has worked quite well because I don't know whether we can see this as a metrics, but when NotPetya was rummaging through Europe and global networks, then Estonia was virtually untouched by those ransomware attacks in 2017. Also because of the very good information sharing and early warning system we have here, and the close public-private partnership between the different parts of our system. So I think this kind of public-private partnership always should start at national level, and when we are taking this to the global level, then we also have to specify what we talk about exactly. I think when I was in the EU, we had many conversations with global companies about the public-private partnership. And I think it was actually somebody from Microsoft who said, well, great that you governments are talking about the public-private partnership, but what exactly do you want from us? And what exactly do you mean we should do? And when we should show up and do something? So I think this was one of the requests from the private sector side to specify a bit what exactly could be done. And I think the Paris call was one of those good initiatives which was launched a few years ago by the French government and a couple of companies that would be a good example of public-private partnership and how this could be taken forward. And of course, I also have been very closely involved in the recent United Nations processes in Open-Ended Working Group and GGE, where we are stressing the important role of the private sector in those reports and recommendations written purely by governments under the first committee of the United Nations. So therefore, I think whenever we are looking at the global ecosystem of cybersecurity and when we are talking about resilience, then certainly the involvement of all stakeholders is always mentioned. But I think if I may to also maybe add something to this debate, there is a field where more of this type of public-private partnership might be necessary, and this is achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So we already have private sector quite involved in setting up the digital ecosystem in the developing nations, but I think it's also important that the private sector involvement will be there to set up the cyber resilience in the developing countries and be part of this effort. So I think that's one of those areas where we could see some future activities happen. I stop here.
Great, thank you very much, Heli. Again, key messages emphasising this need for clear goals, including a national strategy when it comes to public-private partnerships, but also starting at the national level and building out then to the global level. In some respects, you took the thunder out of my next question. I was going to ask you about the Paris call in particular, as well as the efforts with the UN Open-Ended Working Group to involve non-governmental stakeholders. So with that, I think what I might do is ask Jeanette for her perspective on some specific initiatives that you are privy to, Jeanette, at global level that you think are worth delving more deeply into.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we really covered many of them, and the additional ones that I might call out would be the work in the ISO standards, where you have public and private sector coming together to lay out global standards. Very important initiatives, very important for governments to maintain involvement in those bodies. They can really set the future for what organizations in the private sector will be doing. And I think I'd just like to end on Ireland more specifically. When I was in the government, I had the opportunity to visit with our Irish partners a couple of times, and wonderful hosts as always, but was able to learn a great deal about the Irish National Cybersecurity Authority, and was able to participate in a lot of the dialogues that they were having with Irish critical infrastructure. And I thought that their approach was, it really met all the things we sort of talked about, is understanding what Ireland needed to do to, of course, achieve broader global regulatory outcomes, applying that to the Irish context, and having an open dialogue with the Irish private sector, primarily those responsible in those traditional critical infrastructure sectors. So I really applaud Ireland for the work that they're doing, and in the work that they're doing to advance academic research in partnership with academic institutions, both in Ireland and globally, and their sort of strong voice and perspective on data protection, both within Europe and locally and globally. So I'd like to just sort of end with a shout out to the men and women that are working in the Irish National Cybersecurity Center.
Thank you, Jeanette. I can't speak for them, but I would guess that, like all of us, we would have preferred to meet in person and continue the conversations you had when you were last here. I think, Heli, on that, I know while you're based in Estonia, but I wonder whether there are any lessons that you think could apply to the Irish context or other smaller states, if you don't want to speak to the specific Irish context, but it would be good to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I think there are different models actually in Europe you can observe on the cybersecurity public-private partnership, and it might be related to the size of the state, but actually it might be also related to a historical, institutional, organizational history of a country. Well, because we usually I think we can categorize several models in Europe. One model is a small country model, which is based on close relations between the stakeholders and the trust-based, close-knit type of cyber community that actually is located mostly on the civilian side of the government, like Estonian model. So our National Cyber Agency is situated with the Information System Agency, which is purely civilian. It cooperates, of course, with all other agencies and so on, but it is still under the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications. The same type of model we can see in Finland and in some other parts of Northern Europe, where the competence and expertise has been collecting under certain agency on the civilian side and grown there. So the benefits of building this under the civilian side is maybe the easier outreach to the private sector that finds it more easy to talk to the other civilians, not maybe so easily with other militaries or intelligence officials. So the trust is maybe easier to build when there are cyber agencies under the civilian side. But it doesn't mean that it has to be like this. It's just one of the models that we see in Europe. Then we see also a different model, which is a bit more, shall I say, maybe top down, where there is a stronger regulation, usually part of the country's institutional and organizational history, and also this kind of regulation holds together the larger system. And the cyber security is built on a more sectoral model and the sectoral certs and the sectoral certs then reporting to the central cert. So I think we can see this kind of model in France, where there is one national center, but it's also strong sectors, industrial sectors that are actually part of the cyber effort there. And then we have the defense intelligence model as well in Europe, where the cyber expertise is mostly under some defense or intelligence structure, and it is led there, and the national effort is led from there. When the European Union has issued its NIS directive, and we had those NIS coordination groups in Brussels, then we saw very different people coming from capitals there, because the NIS directive asked to determine the competent cyber authority from each country. And this competent cyber authority would be under very different parts of the governmental authorities. So, and in many of, especially maybe Eastern European countries or Southern Eastern European countries, the defense-led model is also there, and I think this is just how the country has decided to set up its model. So it doesn't mean that it's somehow more preferential or than the others. If it works for this country, it is good. So, and I think every country has to decide what model works for them. And set its cyber model to already existing structures that actually are functional. But I think there are some characteristics what one has to keep in mind when building a cyber agency or cyber system. First, this national agency or authority needs to have a good standing amongst other national authorities. If it doesn't have a good standing, if it's not having enough authority, then it has to be elevated to a certain level of authority. We actually did it in Estonia. The information system agency here was first initially at the different status than now, and we elevated its status in terms of national legal system. Well, you know, continental Europe is very legalistic, so I'm not going into the laws, but everything needs to have a law here. And once this new law was passed, then this agency had enough authority to act open and also have monitoring and overseeing function, and this helped. Secondly, this cyber agency needs to be somehow also politically steered in a way that it can easily adapt towards the new situation, and also can have resources available if necessary quite quickly. So it helps that it is somehow under the direct steering of a minister, which would be our case, or a high level of senior leadership. And what we did in Estonia was also that the governance was set in a way that there is a natural element of cooperation and coordination already part of the governance system. So we have a National Cybersecurity Council, which is led by quite high level. So in order, again, to have this kind of political steering function and allow the resources to be allocated quickly if necessary. Because I think in our case, that would be the permanent secretary level, which is chairman of the National Cybersecurity Council, which is the highest body of decision making.
Excellent. Thank you, Heli. Thank you, Jeanette. And thank you, Caitriona, for moderating. Before I leave you go, a fascinating discussion. And Jeanette, if I may come to you with one question. We've spent some time talking about the threat landscape, and I love that digital fortress, and I'm just sorry we haven't got time to get more into that. But if I could ask you, in your view, when you consider the threats that we've been discussing, what do you think is the most important technological innovation that you see coming down that will help us address those threats?
I don't think that there is one technological innovation. I think between migrating to the cloud, where it makes sense for you, and adopting that zero trust philosophy those two components will go a long way to modernizing your security and being able to better defend yourself. Unfortunately, I really don't think there is just one technology that is going to be able to cut across. There's a lot of supporting technologies, but you have to be able to use them in the right way.
It's not just the technology. It's not just one thing that fits. It's one size. It's a holistic approach that we're taking, and the discussion around, you know, government, business, the technology, bringing all of those pieces together. Fantastic. Absolutely. Caitriona, Jeanette and Heli, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. And once again, thank you, and hope you enjoy the rest of the session.